I'm Lauren. Sitting here at my kitchen table, the silence is almost deafening. It's been a while since that fateful anniversary dinner, but the events of that night still play in my mind like a never-ending movie. That dinner was supposed to be a celebration of my parents' 45 years of marriage. The venue was a posh country club, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The room was filled with relatives from far and wide, all there to witness my parents' perfect union. My sister, Sarah, with her designer clothes and perfect smile, was the center of attention as always. And there was my son, Jake, a 13-year-old with a heart as big as the sky, sitting beside me, looking a bit out of place in this fancy setting. My father took the stage with a glass of champagne in his hand, a wide smile on his face. At first, his speech was all about family values and the joy of togetherness. But then, he turned to Sarah and said, "You are the pride of our family. Your two beautiful children are the jewels in our crown." The room erupted in applause, but I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Jake, sitting next to me, looked at his plate for a long time. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, he asked, "What about me, Mom?" That was the moment I snapped. I reached for my glass, tapped it hard on the table, and stood up. The room went silent. I looked straight at my parents and said, "I want to thank you. Thank you for finally being honest in public. For years, you've shown in private that Sarah is the daughter you're proud of, and her kids are the only grandchildren that matter. At least now, Jake doesn't have to wonder if he's imagining it." The shock in the room was palpable. My father's face turned red, and my mother stared at me with that cold, judgmental look she always had. My relatives started to murmur. One cousin said it wasn't the time, and an uncle called me cruel. But I didn't care. I looked at Jake, and his pale face told me everything. He'd known for a long time, but this made it official. We left the dinner without a word. In the cold, dark parking lot, neither Jake nor I said a thing. I unlocked the car, and we got in. I started the engine, but I just sat there, waiting for my phone to ring. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe an apology, or at least a question about where we were going. But nothing came. Halfway home, Jake asked me if Grandpa really meant it. I told him I didn't know what was in Grandpa's heart, but what he said spoke volumes. When we got home, Jake fell asleep on the couch, still in his clothes. I sat at the kitchen table, looking at my phone, waiting for something, anything. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. It was Sarah. She walked in without waiting for an invitation. She looked at Jake, still asleep on the couch, and her prepared speech seemed to vanish. She said, "They were awful last night." I didn't answer. For years, she'd been the golden child, the one our parents boasted about. She then told me that after I left, Mom started smoothing things over, saying I was just sensitive. Dad made a joke about me being dramatic. But Sarah said she'd finally had enough. She confronted them, asking if they'd even looked at Jake during the speech. Mom rolled her eyes and said kids don't notice these things. Sarah told them it was a lie, that they'd been blind for years. I asked her if she really didn't know about our parents' favoritism. She said she'd known they favored her since we were kids, but she didn't realize how cruel it had become after my husband, Tom, died. She'd made excuses for them, telling herself it was just awkwardness or distance. She then asked me how bad things had been after Tom's death. I told her about those first few months. How I felt like I was drowning, how Jake would wake up asking for his dad. Our parents let us stay in their guest house for a couple of months, but they treated it like a huge favor. Mom complained about Jake's toys, and Dad kept asking when I'd get back to normal. They didn't want any crying in the house because it ruined the mood. After that, I had to juggle 2 jobs. I took Jake with me on errands because I couldn't afford proper childcare. There were nights when I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to figure out which bill to pay first. And every time I almost called my parents for help, I remembered the look on Mom's face when I needed emotional support. Sarah then asked if I'd ever helped our parents financially. I told her that over the years, I'd paid for their utility bills, cleared their pharmacy balances, and even bought them groceries when they said they were stretching things. They never asked directly, they just dropped hints. And I kept helping, thinking that one day they'd love me the way I wanted. As I was telling her all this, Jake stirred on the couch. I asked him if he wanted breakfast, and he nodded. Just then, my phone rang. It was Mom. She didn't say hello or ask about Jake. She started yelling about how I'd humiliated them, how I'd turned a beautiful evening into a disaster. She said, after everything we've done for you, and I asked her what exactly that was. She said, we took you in after Tom died. I looked at Sarah, and her face changed. I asked Mom if that was really the story she wanted to go with, considering all the years of neglect. Mom said I was twisting things, that I'd always been hard to help because I pushed people away. Then she said, maybe if you'd been more grateful back then, things would be different now. I simply said, then you don't need to worry. Things are already different. And I hung up. I looked at Sarah and said, I'm done. For the first time, those words didn't feel like a threat. They felt like the truth. Later that afternoon, Sarah came back with a file. It was the family's financial file, the one Dad always kept locked away. She said she'd asked them if they'd put their favoritism in writing, and their non-answers were enough. I opened the file and saw that Sarah was the primary beneficiary of everything. My name was there, but only in a very vague way, and there was nothing set aside for Jake. I also found a note in Mom's handwriting that said, Sarah understands family responsibility. Lauren is too emotional. Jake shouldn't be burdened with family assets. It was like a punch in the gut. I realized that it wasn't just favoritism, it was a system they'd built around Sarah and her family. I closed the file and told Sarah I was done rescuing them, financially and emotionally. She told me that Dad had admitted they were in financial trouble. They'd spent too much on maintaining an image, and now the bills were piling up. Over the next few days, the silence from my parents was deafening. It was like they were regrouping. Then, Sarah called and said she'd told them no more. She'd stood up to them, and they were scared. A cousin texted me, saying she'd heard my parents might be selling the house. One night, Jake was building something in the living room. He looked at me and said, Grandpa and Grandma are in trouble, aren't they? I asked him why he thought that, and he said, people only talk about family when they want something. I was proud of him for seeing things so clearly. I told him that helping someone who hurt you is a choice, not a debt. Then, one Thursday evening, Jake's phone rang. It was Grandpa. Jake didn't answer. He opened the voicemail and handed me the phone. Grandpa's voice was soft, asking Jake to step up for the family because Grandma was crying. Jake asked me, do I matter now because they need something from us? I sat him down and told him the truth. Being related to someone doesn't give them the right to hurt you and then expect loyalty. Love is measured by who shows up when you need them. I told him he didn't have to call Grandpa back. I called Sarah and told her what had happened. She went to our parents' house. An hour later, she called me on speaker. I could hear Mom crying and Dad trying to talk over her. Sarah said, Lauren is on speaker and you're going to listen. Dad tried to frame it as concern, saying he just wanted to repair things. He even said, maybe Jake would be more understanding than his mother. Sarah lost it. She asked if he hurt himself, if he really thought it was okay to go around me and ask Jake for emotional support after humiliating him. Mom said Jake was too young to understand adult problems, but Sarah shot back that he understood them better than they did. I spoke up and said the only reason they were calling Jake was because I'd stopped answering. I told them they'd spent years treating Jake like an afterthought, and now they wanted him to carry the family's burden. Dad asked what we wanted from them. I told him to leave Jake alone, and that their debts and problems were no longer my concern. Sarah then said, you didn't lose one daughter at that anniversary dinner. You lost both the moment you asked her son to pay for your choices. After the call ended, I felt a sense of finality. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Jake came into the kitchen and asked if Grandpa was still mad. I told him being mad doesn't mean being right. He said he didn't want to go there anymore, and I told him he didn't have to. Almost a month passed with no contact. Then, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from my father. He wrote that they'd been wrong, not just at the anniversary dinner but for years. He said they'd mistaken my silence for strength and my distance for independence. He also said Jake deserved better. He asked if we'd agree to a dinner in a neutral place, just to talk. I showed the letter to Jake. He asked if going would mean everything was fixed. I told him no, it just meant we were willing to listen. A few days later, we met at a small diner. My parents looked older, more worn out. My father looked at me and said, "We failed you." My mother started crying and said she'd spent too many years protecting an image instead of the people in the family. My father then apologized to Jake for making him feel invisible. I didn't tell them everything was forgiven. I told them I was choosing peace for myself and Jake, but that didn't mean going back to the way things were. Any future relationship would be on my terms. A few months later, they sold the house. The debts were too much. They moved into a small apartment and faded into the background of family gatherings. Sarah and I started having smaller, more honest holidays. Jake stopped asking why he was never enough, and I knew I'd made the right choice. In the end, what I gave my parents were consequences, not forgiveness. And what I gave Jake was the knowledge that he never has to shrink himself to make others comfortable.